this morning's meeting of the Select Committee on Science and Technology. We're very pleased to have as our first witness Professor Ruth Morgan, Professor of Crime and Forensic Science at UCL and Director of the UCL Centre for Forensic Science. I would like to start by asking you, as the specialist advisor to this committee's previous inquiry in 2018 and 2019, so by way of an opening statement, I think we'd like to ask you what progress has there been on the issues that we identified in that inquiry? Indeed, where has there been progress, and where have things got worse, in your view? Has the government's response to our report been adequate? And is there a sense that someone in government is taking responsibility for forensic science? So those are the opening questions. So please make a start.
Thank you. I just wanted to set the scene a little bit, because I think to answer those questions it's good to see the broad context. And that's really that the 2018 inquiry that the committee held was one of a long line of inquiries into forensic science over the last 20 years. But it was extensive and it was very distinctive because it took a look at the entire system and it delved very deeply into forensic science to find the root causes of a lot of the symptoms that I think had been getting a lot of scrutiny more broadly. And because of that, I think the recommendations that came out of that inquiry addressed those root causes and were very warmly welcomed by the forensic science community broadly. Zooming forward to today, I think it's fair to say that there's frustration that we haven't seen more progress. And I don't believe that progress is in any way because there was anything fundamentally flawed with those recommendations. In fact, those needs that were identified in 2019 remain incredibly salient today, and those recommendations remain absolutely key at the moment. But it does rather raise the question, why have we not seen the progress that we hoped for? And I think there's lots of different factors too that I'd like to highlight. The first is the context. We've had a pandemic since the inquiry, we've had a new government, we've had a number of geopolitical and economic shocks that have rather influenced the public purse, which I think we must bear in mind. And I think the other factor that's worth highlighting is that there's been an issue of focus. So I think there's been over-focus on perhaps some of the more surface-level issues and an under-focus on some of the root issues. And I think the Forensic Science Regulator recommendation is a good example there in terms of the focus on statutory powers for the regulator, which was made, but an under-focus on the full extent of that recommendation, which was to broaden the remit of that role and to get the regulator to revise and reform the procurement process. So I think the bad news is that we are in a position where the 2019 recommendations remain salient. The needs are still very much with us. We haven't seen those foundational changes that we hoped for. But I think the good news is that we do have the ability to turn this around. Forensic science needs effective governance and excellent science. We have one of the most committed and dedicated forensic science communities in the world. We have some of the most excellent scientists in the world, and that hasn't changed since 2019. So we have a very strong basis upon which to build. We've got a capability to be world leading again. But the question remains, is there a will to do that? And that's why the inquiry today is so important, it's so timely, and I hope that it's possible to move forward at this point. In terms of the sub-questions, in terms of what has changed, where are we at? Is there activity within the forensic science community? Yes, I think there is. I think we're seeing a number of areas of activity. I think the police have got a number of areas. The Forensic Capability Network, which is funded by the NPCC, the National Police Chiefs Council, has been active in the last 6 years. We've seen a lot of working groups and activities to support police forces. The Office of the Chief Scientific Advisor to Policing has been very active. And we're seeing a lot of engagement with the development of science and technology strategy from that quarter. I think within the Home Office we're seeing some changes. There's the appointment of the Director of Forensic Science Services, which was made this summer. and the remit of that role to oversee reform in a way that is thinking about the whole system within which forensic science is a part, within which AI and tech features, and thinking about that as a broad system. So I think there are some signs, even if we're not quite where we wanted to be.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a very, very helpful start. We've got a lot more questions to ask. Lord Burnett.
Yes, well, one of the issues that has been identified in connection with forensic science is the limited funding available for research. Science is always moving, and if research isn't moving too, then we're going to fall behind. So can you identify for us the major areas of research and who's doing it? Is it the providers or is it universities, and where's the money coming from? And what in particular are the difficulties in finding money to undertake research to advance forensic science?
Thank you. So I think this remains one of the significant issues, just exactly as you've outlined. I think there are three major areas of research that are probably happening at the moment. The first is in sort of identification and tracing, thinking about the capabilities that we can utilise from physical traces, digital traces, physical pattern evidence. The second is the foundational research that's looking to ensure that we've got the science underpinning for the evaluative interpretation of evidence, whether that's the transfer and persistence of physical traces, whether it's digital evidence and the whole new set of questions that is bringing to the table. And I guess the third area that we're seeing is thinking about how do we bring science insight into the policy space and into the public space. How are we presenting science as it pertains to forensic science with all of those interesting factors, whether that's uncertainty, probabilistic reasoning, those kinds of issues. How are we getting that to different audiences so that it's useful and can be applied? In terms of who's doing that research, I think it's a relatively disparate landscape. I think in the main we're seeing universities picking up in that area, particularly the identification and tracing and foundational research. There is quite a lot going on with pockets of funding from the policing CSA in the form of the so there was a number of things. I'm just trying to think. So the PACE, which was 4.5 million, which was awarded to 9 different centres across the UK for policing centres of excellence. There's a small part of that which has forensic science within it. The police also have the STAR funding, which is there for, particularly I'd say, for that identification and tracing research. That's in the region of 2 million a year for much more technologically ready, but also research that will contribute to technological capabilities in policing. And then in the UKRI did a sandpit in 2023. It was up to 2 million. My understanding is that 3 projects were funded through that. It was more of the order of it was less than the 2 million that they had available, and I think that was mentioned last week. I think there's a distinction that needs to be made between what's needed in forensic science and where the priorities are. So what is needed is not necessarily always within the remit of the funding calls, and therefore we are reliant on a lot of research happening that is either unfunded or being sort of shoehorned in as best we can.
Thank you. Well, Lucas.
That sounds a pretty chaotic state of affairs. You've called in the past for someone to set the agenda. Should that be the proposed National Institute of Forensic Science? And if you had the money needed for forensic science research, what areas would you focus on How do we get that interdisciplinary approach that's required to bring expertise into a range of different disciplines into forensic science, and is UKRI playing the role that it should here? So what should be done? Where should it be done? How much money does it take, and who should be accountable to Parliament for what's happening?
Thank you. The reason I'm pausing is I think it's an incredibly complex question because it's a complex landscape. And I think essentially what we've got on the table is potentially two different models. One which is a centralised capability that has oversight of research and development, that can set an agenda, that can ensure that there is funding available, that can ensure there's collaboration, and benefits from efficiencies of scale, enables the debate and dialogue that's needed across the disparate groups that are involved. And I think that's an approach that works incredibly well for incremental science, where we're iterating and developing existing capabilities. I think the downside of having a fully centralised approach like that is that you reduce the opportunities for the unexpected, and it's a trend that we're seeing more broadly across research, that by taking a more centralised and incremental approach, we're not seeing the transformational breakthroughs that perhaps we saw in the past. So I think there's lots of benefits of having a centralised capability in terms of oversight and responsibility and a point of where the buck stops. But I would be concerned if that was all that we had. I think when we're able to incorporate a more distributed model as well, and I think that's the thing here. I don't think we should have an either or. I think we need to do both. When you've got a more disparate model, there is more space for innovation. There's more space for the serendipitous, which I think is what we've seen in the past leads to the breakthroughs, and I believe we do need some of those breakthroughs in forensic science. If I had the budget, I think that was part of the question, I think we need to keep focused on the important needs, so identification and tracing. We need to focus on the foundation of research for evaluative interpretation. We need to be thinking very, very carefully about how we communicate that science and how that science gets into the hands of those that can utilise it, whether that's in investigation intelligence or in policy. But I think we do need to see more of the arts and humanities and social sciences coming into this, because this is a profoundly technological and people challenge, and if we do this without reference to the wealth of insight that exists in the humanities and arts and social sciences, we're going to be missing things, particularly when you think about the fact that in forensic science we've got the sort of probabilistic, sort of intrinsically uncertain iterative approach of science and the beyond reasonable doubt requirements of the law, and those two have got to come together, and I think that's something we need to address. And I guess the other one is machine learning and artificial intelligence. There's a huge amount of potential there, not only for the capabilities where that's already being deployed in terms of large-scale databases, in terms of triaging. I think there's a huge amount of opportunity there to bring about a renaissance of physical trace in terms of the capabilities that those technologies are going to bring us, particularly I'm thinking fingerprints, footwear. And there's also a huge amount of work to be done with digital evidence, particularly because an awful lot of it is text-based. To interpret what a text means is a profoundly different task to interpret what a physical trace means. A physical trace as a single object of study, it's a drop of blood. We're trying to find out who it belongs to. With a text message or an email, there are multiple objects of study, and we need to be able to hold all of those together if we're going to interpret that effectively. And those are the types of evidence that are becoming incredibly important in cases where physical trace gets us so far but doesn't get us over the line. For example, cases where consent or coercive control are an issue. Often it's those digital forms of evidence that will get us where we need to get to.
Thank you. Councillor Sansgate.
Thank you. Could you comment on how changes to DNA science and sensitivity have affected forensic science in the last few years? For example, are there other scientific developments that you would highlight that have serious implications for forensic science?
Yes. So DNA is not my specialism, but I can speak with an overview. I think we're seeing lots of exciting developments. A lot is happening. Massively parallel sequencing was a particular approach that really started to be adopted about 6 years ago at the time of the previous inquiry. The commercialisation of the equipment that made that analysis possible came through in, I think, around 2021. And there are now we're exploring a lot of broader, wider capabilities for distinguishing how can we use RNA and body fluids in additional ways to what we have been able to in the past. I think we're seeing improved extraction and preservation capabilities of DNA. We're also seeing a real focus on how can we how can we unpick multiple contributors to DNA, which has been a big challenge in the past. So those are all going strong.
My second couple of questions is about the quality of training for forensic scientists in the university sector. We've heard that there may be some undergraduate courses that don't give enough scientific background, and that it may be more effective for people to convert into being forensic scientists from a different first discipline. Do you think there is adequate training for the next generation of forensic scientists, and what would be the best way to provide it, in your view?
I'm very influenced by some of the broader work that's looking at the future of work. There was a study in 2018 from the Institute of the Future that highlighted that from their study that, in their view, 85% of jobs that would be available in 2030 didn't currently exist. So I guess it's in that context that I believe that to have the next generation of forensic scientists, we need to have people who are resilient and agile, who are able to adapt and to respond to things that are changing. And that is no small task. I am a believer in primary discipline undergraduate degrees. I think there's incredible value in gaining deep disciplinary skills and capability and insights, and then you can build on that. And I guess that comes from a position where I'm a strong advocate of interdisciplinarity, and I believe that the complex challenges that we're seeing in the world require interdisciplinarity more and more and more. But my view on that from the research that we've done is that to achieve that, it's less of a case of needing new insight. It's more a case of being able to mine the depth of insight that exists across a broad range of disciplines and being able to bring that together in innovative ways to ask new questions. So in that sense, a thriving next generation of forensic scientists will be a very broad and diverse group that have very different disciplinary capabilities who can bring it together, but they do need to then be able to critically think, to be analytical, to be able to think laterally and across problem challenge areas. So disciplinary undergraduate degrees, I think there's a place for master's degrees that can then bring forensic science approaches, methods, theory, and application capabilities to that first disciplinary skill set.
Will there be enough of them in the future?
I think that's the multi-million-dollar question. I think it won't be my sense is that it won't be a lack of training that means we don't have enough. It's about whether we can retain them in the field. So certainly what we're seeing in the digital space is that it's very, very difficult for forensic science entities to retain their talent because they simply earn so much more money in the private sector. So I think it's more a case of retention.
Lord Lucas, you wanted to come in here.
So how do you handle this at the undergraduate level? I mean, this is going back to the troubles over putting computer games in undergraduate degree titles, and most of them being totally unsuitable for the industry. I mean, it sounds as if those courses that are calling themselves forensic science should be repurposed, if we're to be fair to the students concerned.
I think there's probably a distinction to be made.
Undergraduate degree courses.
There are certain degree programs that have a very clearly stated aim, which is to train in a vocational setting. So those clearly have a very different set of remits and goals to those that are primary discipline degrees. I think that is a question that needs to be addressed, because we do need to make sure that graduates are coming out with skills that mean that they are able to make positive and helpful contributions, whatever the landscape might be when they graduate. But it's a pretty tricky one to answer, but I can see that where the question lies, and I think it's an important thing that needs to be discussed in this board setting.
Ernest Walmsley.
Thank you. My question's about fragmentation. The Westminster Commission suggested that forensic science services should be taken out of the supervision of the police altogether for various reasons, quality, variability, independence, etc., etc. So the question is that practical, especially in light of the fact that if you moved it into the market, the funding would also have to move into the market. So they've done it in Scotland. The situation there, however, is very different. So what model do you think would work in England and Wales?
Another multi-million-dollar question, I think. A very salient one. I think it's a very challenging issue because it is so complex, because there's so much history, antecedent conditions that create a very interesting context. As you mentioned, the Scottish approach is one model, but it is operating in a very different context. We've heard last week. You heard about the sort of the historical approach, which was having forensic science part of the Home Office, which clearly had lots of advantages, and not least an R&D laboratory with 70 active scientists who were working shoulder to shoulder with casework scientists, which I think was certainly a jewel in the crown. But there were challenges in terms of sustainability, efficiency, that have been widely documented. So in terms of what do we do going forward, my sense is that there needs to be some caution, because we run the risk of losing the proverbial baby with the bathwater. I think we've got to find a way to bring together the critical insight that comes from policing, the critical insight that comes from the legal system, and the critical insight that comes from science. And I think trying to do that in a silo has some challenges. I think looking at the broad landscape, in some ways the police are possibly the most invested in forensic science working of everyone. It's incredibly important that forensic science works in terms of the intelligence that they need, in terms of the evidence that is part of their remit. So how do we aim for a best of all worlds approach, I guess, is what we need to think about. And I think the way that has to happen is in a way that ensures that it's not done in silos. Forensic science is very contextual at almost every scale that you look at it, and I think this is another one where context is going to be key. I think we need to explore multiple options rather than just looking at the pros and cons of one particular model. And I'm aware that this takes time, and in lots of ways we're out of time. So in that sense, that's a real tension. But I think there is a way forward if we can have that conversation in a way that has skilled facilitation, a lot of contributions from the very motivated community that we have, but that involves all the voices that need to be represented, and it needs to be done transparently. I think that's important.
You just talked about the need to bring all the elements together, all the various players, and we heard from Professor Nick Dade last week that's exactly what they did in Scotland. But as you've just said, it's a very different context. Do you think it's possible to do that in England and Wales?
I think all things are possible if there's enough will, if there's enough investment. I think it would not be without challenge. There would be a reasonably significant setup cost, both in terms of finance and also hearts and minds. So I think it would be possible, but there would need to be, everyone would need to, a collective would need to be clear that that was the way to go, and keen, and
clear objective
and a transparent process to get there.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Alice Noel-Jones.
This is partly also to do with the model we're operating, and also it leads also into the question of how research is done. What we've heard is that one of the concerns of the current system is that it can indeed, I think people would say it is, leading to the, if not the extinction, certainly the subordination and much less emphasis on different specialisms in forensic science. You know, things like fibre analysis or blood pattern analysis and indeed toxicology. So you talk about bringing things together. Do you think that there is a way, there is a model how we can preserve these specialisms? Because it seems they're in danger of being driven to the wall, of being too expensive and not used enough. Is a national institute one of the answers, or how would you go about it?
So I've been thinking about this in terms of what we saw historically is that these so-called niche capabilities were able to thrive because, crudely speaking, there was more money in the system and it was possible to cross-pollinate. So where there was surplus generated in one area, it could be used to support niche areas where perhaps there is a huge amount of value in specific cases, but it's less easy to demonstrate financial value. And I guess what that illustrates is a critical issue I think we see in forensic science, where there's lots of parts of forensic science are highly valuable, but it's not really very easy to quantify the value in financial terms. And so I think trying to preserve and ensure that niche areas thrive is something that can't be done in a silo. I think it's got to be done more collectively. So in that sense, I think as part of a broader body like a national institute, there's some light. I think that could be a possible way to bring the component parts together, so that as a whole we're greater than the sum of our parts, and we're able to support one area so that we have it available when it's absolutely critical, even if it's not a financially viable one, if it sits alone.
Do you actually believe these specialisms are being lost as things stand, and is that serious?
I think it's incredibly difficult for the leaders with the people who have those niche capabilities to remain viable in a solely forensic science context.
That matters or not?
I think it. I would position myself to say that if we need a particular form of specialist capability on a very few number of cases a year, but it is absolutely critical in those cases and there's no other way of solving them, then yes, we need them.
Right. So do you have in your mind's eye a way of doing this?
I mean, I think the cross-pollination system is the one that seems most credible. And I guess that's in two ways. One is having that niche area as part of a whole, so that there can be support. I guess what we saw historically as well is that there were niche areas that... So I came from an environmental science background, and in that setting, as with others, there there were experts who were able to deploy their skills and capabilities for forensic science applications, but also in other applications, such as environmental reconstruction. And that as a whole enabled that to survive. The challenge with that is that you can't simply transpose what you do in one domain into a forensic science domain. There is quite a lot that needs to be done, and I think you heard last week about the challenges of accreditation and the costs involved in making sure that things are all above board and the assurances are there for the procurers of that work. So I think the only way I see forward is that these have to be part of a broader whole, and we have to be able to sit with the fact that they're never going to necessarily be financially viable, but they are so valuable that we do need to find a way to keep them alive.
Thank you.
Well, that,
Could I just follow up on that? As a former judge, I'm slightly disturbed to hear that those particular topics are thought to be niche. I mean, fibre analysis, toxicology, and so forth, as you've indicated, can be absolutely critical in quite a large number of cases. Really, my question is this: you're talking about what's going on principally in England and Wales, and a withering is the impression that what one gets. Is this true more widely in advanced nations? In other words, I mean, if push came to shove, could the necessary expertise be found in Europe when a judgment is made here that the specialism is not available in an appropriate case?
I think that's for certain disciplines that could be feasible. Obviously, in Europe, you've got a different system. We have an adversarial system, which is different. That doesn't need to be a deal breaker. I think we see a lot of synergies with what's going on in Australia. Their legal system is closer. Obviously, there's time and distance issues there. So yes, I think there's that could be worth exploring. But I do think context is very important, and so there would need to be a way of ensuring that expertise was being applied into an England and Wales setting in ways that were appropriate, and we could demonstrate the quality and the assurances that would be needed.
Yes, well, thank you.
Baroness Mortover.
Yes, thank you. And I'm in some ways going to link the question back to your original statement about the as it were, the financial situation here. So as we've understood it, post 2008 crash, then all sorts of areas were being scrutinised and so-called quangos were being dismantled and such like, and this was one that went that way. And you've mentioned inefficiencies, and we've heard that too, that initially, when in effect it was privatised or put out to that private market, that it worked well, but then the big provider either squeezed out the other ones or there wasn't sufficient funding, and so the market narrows and narrows down, and produced an unstable situation that we're addressing now. Now, you've just mentioned that when, subsequent to the previous report, there was the pandemic and political and economic shocks, and those continue. So you've got huge pressure on the economy, and this is one bit over here. And so you're talking about what you'd ideally like to see, but in that context. So it's much more vulnerable being outside that state provision that it was in before. So given that instability, and hearing that the situation seems to have got worse with the near monopoly of provision, but the pressure even upon that that company. The question is how much has funding for forensic science in the UK declined, but actually, more importantly, what reforms would actually lead to a sustainable funding model? You've been talking about what you'd ideally like to see, but you started by saying the context is extremely negative because of the situation that the country or the world is in. So how do you make it sustainable? And does the procurement of forensic services need to change, and if so, how? What sort of model do you see as being sustainable and effective?
Yes, that's incredibly helpful framing, thank you. It's quite difficult to work out the size of the cuts that we've seen, but we do know that police have seen successive cuts, and there's been another one very recently. And we also know that because of the pressure to ensure that there's frontline policing visible, those cuts hit the less visible parts more hard, and obviously forensic science is one of those. In the context of such pressure, I think possibly there's a couple of things that I think would be worth exploring. The first is reframing forensic science. I think forensic science is seen as a service, and I wonder if we saw it as a fundamental part of the infrastructure of justice and national security, that might help in terms of making a case for its value.
Could you expand on national security? Because obviously that is a prime concern at the moment. How do you put it in terms of national security?
So in terms of the value that science evidence can bring to both building an intelligence picture of what's happening, what is emerging, what early warning approaches. And I think there's also an element there of the value of how much, so there's the intelligence side, but the evidence side is also very critical given the scrutiny that the government's under in the national security sort of umbrella. And digital is only going to play a bigger role to that. And I think forensic science could position itself as the enabler of ensuring that we have the world-class automated approaches, the AIs, the machine learning capabilities that we need to be far more, maintain our capabilities in securing our borders, but also that national security agenda.
And that would feed into the justice side because you were building up that capacity elsewhere.
I believe that would bring funding in that would enable the R&D that's needed, which would then support the use of science evidence in the justice system. I suppose it's a good example of dual use, maybe. So that would certainly be one way. I'm very aware that people must come to you a lot and just say, we just need more money, and that will solve our problems. And I think there's so much that can be done. But I think we are really at a point here where there does need to be some investment. And that might be one way of releasing some budget in a way that is mutually beneficial.
Okay, thank you, that's interesting.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, or the committee wants to ask you about, is more about digital forensics and AI, which you've touched on already. In our previous inquiry, we raised concerns about the rise of digital forensics in terms of the scale and volume. I think it's been said that 80% of all cases now are to do with digital forensics, and that's principally around mobile phone data. Is that correct?
And other devices.
And other devices,
but
yeah.
Mobiles, yeah.
And what we really want to ask you now is, there are concerns about bias, and there are concerns about even fake evidence. We're in a world where it's quite possible now to have data on mobile phones might not even be genuine. How is that being addressed?
If I may, I'd just love to connect that to the previous question very briefly in terms of misinformation, disinformation, fake information. That is at the very top of the national security agenda. That is being highlighted as one of the key threats. So then if we can think about how forensic science can address that, and I believe we are a very well-placed discipline to do that, that hopefully is another part of the offer that could be made there. It's a hugely growing area. It's not just in terms of the capabilities that are growing, it's the speed and the pace and the scale that they are changing things. Is the necessary R&D happening? There is a lot of work happening, but I think we're seeing some quite interesting differentiators to emerging technologies that we may have seen in the past. So I think for digital, we're seeing that the sort of the centre of gravity of that research is happening outside of the university sector. Possibly for the first time, it's happening in the commercial sector, and that has a whole. There's lots of benefits to that, but there's challenges that are associated with that. I think it's worth saying that there's a lot of machine learning and AI and digital capabilities that have been existing, have been working in forensic science for many, many years, if you look at some of the database capabilities. So it's not that it's a brand new thing, but it is something that is changing, and I think there's a growing sense that we are entering into a very significant decade in terms of the changes that we're going to be seeing. So to what degree is it happening? It is happening, but it is, I know that the work that's happening within the NPCC, for example, has struggled because of funding problems. Going forward, I think we need to have some recognition that there are lots of resonances with physical trace. Digital traces are not completely different to physical trace, and we have a wealth of insight and capability to deal with physical traces that is pertinent and relevant to digital. But there is a profound difference, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the nature of these forms of evidence. So physical trace has a single object of study, digital traces have multiple objects of study, and that means we can't transpose the way that we evaluate and interpret physical traces to digital traces, and it's predominantly those text-based digital traces that I'm talking about. So that requires something quite significant. How do we hold together the understanding of the intent of the person who wrote a message with the metadata that tells us which device and where they were, with the textual analysis of the meaning of words depending on who sent it and what part of the world they sent it, what was the generation of the people involved in that conversation. How do we hold all those insights together, which often are contradictory, seemingly, and how do we then present that in a legal setting which requires beyond reasonable doubt, without sort of coming to a sort of tending towards a mean, which gets a sort of a soggy middle rather than the strengths of each of those insights, so that we can build up that bigger picture. So I think that's one area where we need to see a lot more research and acknowledgement. I think the other is that it's an interestingly big significant shift between physical traces, where generally speaking it was a case of trying to find that minute microscopic trace and actually elicit as much information as you possibly could out of an incredibly small amount of material. We're now in a situation where there is so much material, it's finding what's relevant and then interpreting what that means in a sea of insights. So again, that's a very significant difference, and one that we need to really...
And on the question of machine learning and AI in this increasing use that you've been referring to, is there any degree of regulatory oversight? I mean, AI is sometimes, perhaps many times, a cause for concern. What extent is there regulatory oversight of the use of AI in examining forensic evidence?
I think we stand with many other areas where there is not a huge amount of oversight. I'm not aware of. I'm not aware that forensic science is leading the way on regulation and oversight. And I know that there have been concerns about the level of regulation of digital materials over and above the physical traces. So I think that is certainly something that needs to be looked at. It needs to be looked at carefully. Innovation and opportunity exist on the one hand, with the potential for harm and unintended consequences on the other. So there does need to be balance, but I also think that we need to recognise that as much as there's bias and the influence of intrinsic and extrinsic factors in human decision making, those exist in the digital realm as well. And the solution in the human side of things is not to exclude all bias, because that means excluding all people. We have to find a way to live with that and ensure that there's as much transparency as possible. But eliminating bias, I think, would be a road to nowhere.
Thank you. Baroness Walmsley.
Thank you. I get the impression that there's a lot going on, but there's not enough, perhaps, regulatory oversight over it. So the question really is, given that there is a big opportunity in digital and AI forensics, so what do you think the government should do in responding to that opportunity?
I think it's part of a much wider conversation that's going on. I would like to see forensic science being part of that conversation as a critical application area, but I think it does need to be done at that broad picture level. Clearly the stakes are high in forensic science, and so we do need to be looking at ways to minimise harms, anticipate unintended consequences. I'm afraid I can't think.
Is there a forum for the potential for forensic science to be part of in the wider picture that you've just referred to? Do you know of a forum, or is it a matter of the forensic science community muscling its way in to this, broader discussion that you quite rightly referred to?
There are a number of conversations going on. I think the government has got clear groups which are looking at this, particularly in terms of how can we ensure that the UK is ahead and we're equipping our.
To whom are they reporting?
So my understanding is that the Prime Minister is overseeing one of these conversations. It's a working group, I think, that's looking at how. I could probably find the details and send them later. Sorry, I haven't got them in my mind. Okay. But I think that's one area. I also think I'm a great believer in science being at the table and not on tap when there's a crisis. So I do wonder if there's a role potentially for an advisory council, a forensic science advisory council, either for the Chief Scientific Advisor in the Home Office or the government's Chief Scientific Advisor, and whether that might be a way of infusing the needs, but also the capabilities that forensic science has into these broader national agendas. Might be one way.
Baroness Young.
When you talked about research, you talked about a sort of blended model of getting the benefits of some centralisation, but also the benefits of a more disparate model. Does that read across into how you feel about forensic science being supervised by the police? Or are you more black and white on that one? Do you think the almost total oversight of the forensic science that's now in existence by the police is a good thing or a bad thing?
My sense is that the police have oversight of a part of forensic science, but they don't have oversight over, say the research agenda. So I think what I keep coming back to is the recommendation that the committee made back in 2019, which was having two entities, the Forensic Science Board, which could be an arm's length group that would be answerable to the Ministers for the Home Office and the Ministry of Justice, and that would have that broad oversight across the whole piece. And then the National Institute, which would have the remit to have oversight over the research strategy and enabling of that research. And I guess I have struggled to find another option that as elegantly addresses that need as the one that was outlined. I suppose I would be cautious of having a single entity with oversight over the entirety of forensic science for a whole host of reasons, not because people aren't intending to do good. I just think diversity and friction foster innovation, and we need elements of that alongside the oversight and accountability and responsibility that forensic science does very much need.
Thank you. So, one of the things that, of course, happened since our report was that the forensic science regulator got statutory powers, but we hear that it doesn't use them very often because the market might collapse if it did, that it's regarded by the police as a bit of a nuisance rather than an asset, that it may be establishing standards that would be okay if the market was well functioning, but actually are inappropriate for the current setup. I mean, how do you feel they're doing?
I think since the last report, there was the appointment of a new regulator from the time of the original inquiry, and that term has also finished. And this summer was the appointment of the newest forensic science regulator. And I think there's quite a difference between those two appointments. The first had a policing and forensic science background. The current regulator comes from a regulatory background rather than a forensic science background. From what I've heard, that is being presented, as this is a regulatory role, and things and those powers will be used where necessary. But I think it's too early to tell quite what the context is right now.
So what was your, I know this sounds a bit brutal, but what was your verdict on the previous regime, the first one?
I think that the role of forensic science regulator has been a really challenging one in every single iteration that it's been, and for different reasons. In terms of the last few years, getting the royal assent was very time consuming. Producing the codes of practice was also very time consuming, and the state of the market and the state of forensic science services was incredibly precarious. I think it was an incredibly difficult balancing act.
And allegedly the current terms mean that it can't regulate the market, simply the providers. Is that really the case? I mean, I come from a regulatory background myself, and I've always regarded the market as fair play, in that that's where the regulators sit. You can't really, providers sit. You can't really regulate the providers without having an eye to the market as well. I mean, do you think that has been an omission, and will the new broom do something about that?
I think that is exactly where the recommendation that the committee made in 2019 was so critical, because it wasn't just about awarding statutory powers to the regulator. It was about expanding and broadening the remit of that role and enabling them to do that regulatory work. And that's the thing that didn't happen. And so I think that's why things are still very challenging. And we're seeing a piecemeal development rather than that broader picture of equipping that role to do that regulatory work.
And presumably with the number of staff that the regulators have got, because they've only got 8 people and they're still a part-time role themselves, it feels a bit thin.
Baroness Walmsley.
Thank you. I was interested in your first answer to Baroness Young. You mentioned the Home Office and the Department of Justice. But currently, as I understand it, the responsibility lies just with the Home Office. And some suggestions have been made that it should be the Department of Justice. And it occurs to me that particularly if oversight was moved from the police to an independent group, a more independent market and independent oversight, the Department of Justice would be more appropriate. But it could well be a cross-government responsibility because we're talking about research, and the Department of Science, Innovation and Technology may also have a role here. So then it gets more complicated, and cross-government working is often not terribly successful. Do you have any view about that?
I think, yeah, I agree that more than a single point of responsibility, a single point of contact makes things incredibly challenging and difficult. I do wonder, though, if there's a way of maybe perhaps one of those having ultimate oversight, but there being clarity about the importance of the insight from those other departments, because I mean, this is you're illustrating the exact issue that I think forensic science has suffered from for decades, which is it has to be multidisciplinary. It has to bring in practice and research and science and law. It cannot operate effectively without all of those contributing and working together well. And the way that our institutions are structured doesn't lend itself. There are too many cracks for it to fall down. So we either need to build bridges or we need to create a single point of contact, but with clear contributions from the relevant departments, because otherwise, too many cracks.
We've heard concerns about storage of evidence and archives and the difference since the closure of the FSS and the inconsistent storage practices with different police forces. Can you comment on that?
It's not something I've engaged with a lot, so I'm only able to share the insights that I've observed, but that fragmented landscape does seem problematic, and I've seen cases where it's not been possible to retrieve items, it's not been possible to reevaluate those items, and that really does raise a question as to whether or not we are able to deliver the justice.
Yes, I mean, it seems particularly important in the context of potential miscarriages of justice that
Yes.
That some years on something might emerge, and if the original forensic evidence or physical evidence is somehow missing or is not well managed, that really is very unfortunate in terms of preventing potential miscarriages of justice.
And sorting them out, yes, after the fact. And particularly because often it's not 1 year, 2 year, it's often 15 years, 20 years.
Yes.
So,
And there has been are we right in understanding that since the closure of the FSS, the management of evidence in terms of archiving and storage has not been ideal? Is that your view?
So my understanding is it has been become a distributed model that each force deals with it in their own way, and that therefore leads to a lot of variability, and it does seem to have resulted in something of a postcode lottery in terms of whether or not your evidence will remain accessible, preserved in the ways that mean it is then viable for reanalysis.
Baroness Northover.
Okay, yes, just sort of drawing this together, you've mentioned that, drawing from the last report, that you think that there should be a board answerable to MOJ, an institute to oversee research strategy, and a need for sustainable finance. Are those your key recommendations for the government to improve the provision of forensic science in the UK, or have you got others?
My sense of this is that because forensic science is broad and it is complex, there are lots of different voices that all have important contributions to make, that we've got to put this problem and this challenge in the right light. It's too easy to get caught up in issues of funding and infrastructures, institutions, expertise, forms of expertise. My sense is that forensic science is critically bound up in a justice system that is cracking, and that if it reaches a tipping point, it's going to be incredibly difficult to recover from. And I believe there's an emerging opportunity in terms of national security where forensic science is also absolutely critical and key to ensuring that we are world leading in that area. So I think, in answer to your question, I think there are two key things on my mind. The first is the question that I think still remains from the 2019 report, which is the one about oversight, accountability and responsibility. The government does need to lead the way in terms of how to bring together the key voices that we have within forensic science, policing, the justice system, the forensic service providers, the researchers, the full remit, to ensure that we are able to ensure that there is science in the justice system, in our national security ecosystem, that means that we remain world leading. And the second, and I'm so frustrated that this is the one I'm coming to you with, but it does require investment. The funding, it is critical at this point. There has to be investment in ensuring that forensic science is accessible to the prosecution and the defence, and to the national security agenda. And we do have to have a strategy for forensic science research that ensures that we have both the immediate capabilities underpinned by good science, but we also have a pipeline coming through so that we're ready for the future things that are emerging very rapidly, and are difficult to predict with the current. We can't assume that the tools we have now are going to be fit for purpose in the future. I think that one of the ways we do that is by connecting these needs to the top priorities of government. National security and the justice system have got to be in there. There's a role for showing better how forensic science will tackle misinformation, can tackle digital evidence, for example. But we do need to ensure that the window of opportunity that exists right now to address this is acted on. And I fear that it is getting to a point where that window is closing.
And the tail end of the question, which you'll see in front of you, is what do you think it's going to take for the government to take notice of this and act? You have mentioned the pressure on the justice system. We see MOJ dealing with prisoners who've been released who shouldn't have been. You've got the Home Office regarded as a dysfunctional department, trying to tackle a multitude of problems, including especially what's happening in terms of what is described as illegal migration and so on. So all of those things are registering with the public. The government is seeking to respond. How do you get this into their thinking at all, so that the kind of solutions that you're talking about there might be addressed?
I think there's a place for top-down. I think there's a place for recommendations from a committee such as this one to re-highlight the importance of tackling this situation. But I also think there's a significant role for grassroots. So I think creating channels for input to science advisory mechanisms that already exist could be a very helpful way of going about this. And I also think telling the story of forensic science in ways that connects with the public. People have said to me in the past, I'm a researcher in this space. For people to really understand why what you do matters, we need to have a big miscarriage of justice, and that will demonstrate. We've had many miscarriages of justice. So I have come to the conclusion that we don't need a miscarriage of justice. We need a David Attenborough who championed the climate agenda. He told incredible stories that beamed into people's living rooms for years and years. He told stories that connected with people. So we need to get better at telling the story of forensic science to show people why it matters, why we need to ensure that we have a thriving science system that works in our country, and hopefully that will drive the debate and make it a priority.
Well, Professor Morgan, that's a very good ending to this interesting session. Thank you very much for coming to talk to us and reflecting on what you've seen in the last 6 or 7 years since our first inquiry. So we're very grateful. Thank you very much. We're going to pause this now. We prepare for the next session. Welcome to the second session of today's inquiry on forensic science and the criminal justice system. I'm very pleased to welcome two witnesses, Dr. Vanhinsbergh, who is coming in online. He's Managing Director at Key Forensic Services, and Dr. Mark Pearse, who's Director at Eurofins Forensic Services. So we invited you both today to get some insight into the market for forensic science services in England and Wales. And perhaps you could each start by introducing yourselves and telling us about your company and the type of services that you provide and what provides the majority of the income for each of your companies. That would be useful to know. So shall we start with you, Dr. Pearse?
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for welcoming me back to give an update since the last report in 2019. I've been in forensic science now for 33 years. I started my career in the Metropolitan Police Service as an expert witness in question documents, and then moved to the Home Office Forensic Science Service, the agency that obviously closed in 2011-2012. Moved to the private sector shortly before that agency closed to join LGC Forensics, or LGC in their forensics division, and that division was then acquired by Eurofins in 2017 to create Eurofins Forensic Services Limited as a legal entity, a limited company registered in the UK. And then obviously last year in 2024, I guess you'll be aware that Orchid Cellmark Limited, who trade as Cellmark Forensic Services, got into financial distress, and through a formal process overseen and investigated by the Competition and Markets Authority, Eurofins acquired Orchid Cellmark Limited last August. So I'm now currently a director of both Eurofins Forensic Services Limited and Orchid Cellmark Limited, who I from now on I'll call Cellmark. So that's my specific responsibilities within Eurofins. I also want to point out that I am chair of the UK and Ireland Association of Forensic Science Providers. That's a non-commercial body that has members, I can list the members for you, the Scottish Police Authority, Forensic Science Northern Ireland, the Metropolitan Police Service, the MOD, DSTL, Department of Science and Technology Laboratory, Forensic Science Ireland, and DES is also a member, Key Forensic Services is also a member of that body. We work together for the good of forensic science. We have 9 working groups by subject and run a quality collaborative exercise programme and share best practice. I'm also a board member of the European Network of Forensic Science Institutes, ENPSI, who have over 70 state members across the Council of Europe, wider than just the EU. And again, ENPSI has a collection of 17 working groups with fees and a working budget of over £400,000, and they receive £1 million a year roughly from the EU to do special projects to further the cause of forensic science across Europe. And I have to say that UK is an active player in ENPSI. Not only am I a board member, but we chair the UK chairs 3 of the 17 working groups, and Eurofins actually specifically chairs one of those. In terms of Eurofins' background, you're probably aware that we're a global scientific services company that operates in what's called the testing, inspection and certification sector broadly. That's where testing is required to certify, authenticate or vouch for quality. Obviously forensics would sit in that. The global company turns over €7.5 billion a year, so it's an enormous company of scale, 65,000 employees across 62 countries, with 900 separate legal entities or businesses, Eurofins Forensic Services and Orchid Cellmark being one of those, or 2 of those. Founded in 1987 by the current CEO and headquarters in Brussels. From a forensics point of view, forensic science represents only 2% of Eurofins' entire global business, and in fact forensics is focused on Europe only. We have labs in the United Kingdom, obviously England and Wales more specifically, the Netherlands, Germany, Belgium and France. 67% of our work is done from our UK base, reflecting the history of the market in the last 15 years with the closure of the FSS. But we have significant businesses in the other markets too. The other markets are very different. We, in 2019, set up a company in the Netherlands. It's quite interesting that now in the Netherlands we provide 2/3 of all the DNA profiling for the Dutch police and justice system, working with the Netherlands Forensic Institute, and we do a third of all the autopsies that are provided in the Netherlands, and are working hand in glove with the Netherlands Forensic Institute to provide what is a very new way of working over there. In the context of scale, just to give you a feel, the combined Eurofins Forensic Services and Orchid Salmat Limited turn over just over £90 million a year collectively. We provide services across the range of traditional forensics. We don't do digital, for the prosecution at least. So that includes biology casework, which is forensic science to support violence against the person by and large. That could be homicide, it could be assault, it could be sexual offences. We provide DNA services in support of that, but DNA services also for paste sample, subject sampling. Toxicology is 20% of our business, so it's far from the niche service that was being described. It's a key subject area with many thousands of cases being processed a year, so I would not categorise toxicology in the way it has been so far. Drugs, marks and traces, which probably would sit in this broad category of niche, and a few other service lines as well. In relative scale, and the scale of our operation and the percentages I'll read to you now, reflects really the market proportions as well. I hope Des will be supportive of this view, but biology casework is about 35% of the activity that we do in terms of revenue, but that fits with cases as well in terms of people commitment. DNA is about 21%, toxicology 20%, drugs 7%, and this marks and traces area, which we've referred to so many times today and previously, which would include the things like fibres that you mentioned, but also gunshot residues, glass, paint, etc., is about 4%, so a very small area. And then the businesses that we do that contribute to forensic science in the broadest sense outside of core police will be about 9%. And before I finish, I guess it's worth just pointing out that we have over 1,000 people, or just around 1,000 people now. People are the essence of our business, the expertise that we bring to the table to do the casework that's been described both today and previously, developing case strategies, working with the police to make sure that the points that we're going to prove in that case strategy are followed up by the right tests and are assessed appropriately, and proper deductive inference and scientific method is applied. That's our heart, and over 50% of our cost, if you like, or our revenue, we spend on people, just to give that scale. We're a people-led business, and we'll come on to later some of the tensions around budget and what that means in terms of staff retention and what we need to pay qualified experts to keep them in the forensic science sector.
Thank you, that's very helpful. Before I ask Dr. Vanhinsbergh to come in, just to clarify, I think you're saying that the forensic science side of Eurofins' operation is about £90 million a year, of which about 2/3 is the UK. Is that right?
No, the forensics, the overall in Europe, we're probably talking 150 million euros. And then the forensics, and then the UK part of that is £90 million.
I said the UK part is 90 million.
So Eurofins Forensic Services Limited and Orchid Salmat Limited, as two separate entities working in partnership as sister companies within Eurofins, turn over about £90 million a year at the moment.
Okay, thank you. And it would be right to say, would it, that that's the majority of that, if not all of that, is from the police forces? Is that right?
Yes. As I say, we can look, and it's probably 9% that comes from non-police work. Most of that is also law enforcement, perhaps HMRC, that kind of thing, providing services to the criminal justice system. Some of it is providing services to corporate clients, workplace drug testing, where the essence of the test still results in a sanction on somebody, and therefore the principles of forensic science still apply.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Vanhinsbergh, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us about your company?
Yes. Thank you. Good morning. I've been involved in forensic science for about 25 years, and I've been a director of key forensic services for 10 of those years. I was formerly a practitioner, an expert in biological evidence and DNA interpretation, and I was trained by the Forensic Science Service. I then left the Forensic Science Service in 2006 and moved to Key Forensics. Key Forensics has been around for about 20 years. So I've been with Key Forensics from not the very start, but close to the start of the business. And it was founded by an ex-FSS employee, and I've been on that journey from then until now. I've been involved at various levels. So I've been a director for 10 years, and then I was promoted to managing director in October in 2022. So I've been a managing director for 3 years. Our business is a very different business in some ways. We are part of a larger group. We were bought out of administration in 2018 by an acquisition company based in the northwest of England called Corpac. Corpac still owns Key Forensic, and it owns over 50 businesses across the UK. So it's quite a large group. We provide a very broad range of services at Key Forensic. We're quite small compared to Eurofins. We're an SME, so we've got less than 250 employees. We're sitting at the moment at about 235 employees. The majority of those employees are scientists, including some very experienced forensic scientists who've been in the job a very long time. And we provide a broad range of services, including DNA testing, biology services, which is around body fluid examination mainly, and blood pattern analysis, drugs testing and toxicological testing. We also provide firearm services and marks and traces services. In terms of the relative quantity, in terms of the revenue that those different activities generate, for Key Forensics, about 50% of our revenue is generated from biology and DNA services. And the majority of the rest is split between toxicology testing and controlled drugs testing. Firearms makes up about 4%, and marks and traces makes up about 1%. It's worth saying we don't provide all marks and traces services, and up until recently we were providing gunshot residue services, glass, footwear and fibres. So not a full suite of marks and traces, but we are doing our best to support those different disciplines.
Thank you.
Our turnover of our business is roughly about £18 million a year, and that is most of that is generated from the submissions that come in from police forces. There is about up to £2 million a year comes from the His Majesty's Prisons and Probation Service, where we have a contract for drugs testing. And that's it.
Thank you very much. Baroness Wormsley, you want to come in?
Thank you. Just a little clarification before we move on. From the list that both of you have provided of the services that you offer, I think, Dr. Pearse, you said in terms you don't do digital, and I didn't hear Dr. Vanhinsbergh mention digital either. Who does it?
Well, we do digital for the defence, but perhaps come on to that later. I mean, the vast majority of digital work is done in-house by the police, and then that's supported by a host of smaller SME private sector companies.
I see. Thank you.
That's very helpful. Thank you very much, both of you, as a very interesting introduction. We have quite a number of questions for you both. Baroness Young.
How are you feeling about the market at the moment? I mean, it must be quite strange, if I could put this to Dr. Pearse, to be such a big share of the market. I mean, it must be quite nice to be such a big share of the market, but on the other hand, you can't help feeling that's not much of a market.
No, I mean, that's right. I mean, to cut to the chase, we have to review where we want to go with this market and what does a traditional commodity-based tender procured market serve for forensic science, and now is the time to take stock, I think. But to go back to the beginning of your question, I think, how does it feel? Your report in 2019 highlighted some of the issues that perhaps were at most acute stage at that point, where funding was such where the market was probably £60-65 million in total for the type of work that we're talking about. I'm pleased to say that's increased, and so now we're talking a market of traditional forensics in England and Wales of probably 100 to 110 million. That's increased primarily not because of increased volumes necessarily, but that's because we've rebased pricing in response to incidents in the market and due to the negotiation of better and more sensible and commercially viable terms and conditions, which would include indexation on contracts. Clearly, how it's felt in the last 2 years has been slightly dominated by the incident with Selmart Forensic Services, Orchid Selmart Limited. They suffered from a number of factors. COVID didn't help. The profile of work and demand changed through COVID, understandably. That affected the business model. Cash flow was an issue, although we are grateful to the government for ensuring prompt payment from police forces. But that and legacy toxic, again I use that word I used last time, pricing left Selmart struggling, where their cost base vastly outstripped the revenues coming in, and then we had simple business dynamics and economics that led to their demise. They worked with the police at a national level and the Home Office and a new organisation called Blue Light Commercial that was set up a few years ago to oversee procurement across the police sector, to make sure that they didn't leave the market in an unmanaged way. The police, the NPCC guys quantified the cost to the taxpayer of an unmanaged exit to be about £30 million. And I think that's probably understating it in terms of disruption to policing and the amount of recovery needed, but more importantly, the impact on courts and investigation dates would have been severe. But we stepped in. We worked with the CMA to do a phase 1 investigation, and we purchased the company in August last year, and have been working on a turnaround plan ever since, and that turnaround plan continues and will do for some months. So and it's not all bad, I have to say. If you indulge me a little bit, I think from a Eurofins perspective, since 2020, we've invested £50 million in infrastructure in this sector. We've built a whole new building at Tamworth, which has a state-of-the-art centre for marks and traces. It has purposely built laboratories with excellent lean process design for biology casework and drugs. We've repurposed a building in Feltham to be our centre of toxicology, where we've introduced world-leading methodology for the extraction of drugs from whole blood in an automated way. And we've repurposed our DNA unit in Warrington to be a consolidated DNA centre. We've innovated methods. I can think of 2 off the top of my head that are transformatory in terms of DNA success rates on fired ammunition. We've taken from 4 to 54%. We've developed body fluid identification that will help that we've just launched that will help the police prosecute and work in the area of violence against women and girls and support sex offences. We've implemented the statutory code, as Des will talk about and has done, on time. We invest in a quality culture such that we feel that we work very well with the regulator. As I say, we play our full role with the AFSP and EMPSI and fund PhD students. So it feels a dynamic environment. And I have to say, to be fair, from a police and governance perspective, the Home Office launched, since your last report, the Forensic Science Reform Programme, which I think others have mentioned, the 4 priority areas of police capabilities, court capability and understanding, innovation and regulation. Some successes, not enough. The Blue Light Commercial Organisation has brought consistency of approach to procurement with better terms and conditions and standardisation of products. And we're starting to work with them now on more effective contract management, baby steps on that one, with a strategic supplier relationship management programme. The Forensic Capability Network, run by the NPCC, has initiated, and we're almost at the final stages of starting a YSTR database, which will be class leading, certainly in the UK and across many countries. And obviously the code of practice with the regulator, but the recently introduced Director of Forensic Services and the potential of the National Centre of Policing to include forensics are all positive, I think. But we've not achieved enough. And all this good stuff on paper has not resulted in practice in enough material difference. And the harsh reality at the moment is that the funding, the revenues, however you want to describe the cash in the system, is too low overall for the numbers of forensic scientists we need with the skills that they've got to pay them enough to keep them in all areas. The contracts that we've got with the police, we focus too much on the contracts, and the attitude of public versus private means that we don't work collectively and closely enough in collaboration. It does contrast with Scotland, There are issues with the Scottish model that I could talk about for a long time, but we need to work together more strategically. We need to plan and business plan together, and that's it feels that we don't do enough of that at all. There's no strategic alignment of our capacity with policing demand. We don't work enough at the practical level, or the contracts don't enable the conversations at the practical level to support this process. I think you heard last week of case assessment, analysis, to carry out the strategy you've done the case assessment on, and then the interpretation of the results. We do that, and we do that very well with our passionate and very skilled scientists across all AFSP members, and I hope Des will support this. But we do that despite some of the way the contracts are set up and despite the relationships, I think, and we need to enable that a little bit more. And I think, you know, we've just gone through and come out of the other side of the most recent tender, which was a tender for about 35% of the police forces in England and Wales put out in the new blue light commercial style tender. And it was well-meaning and good, and I appreciate and value the move to standardisation. But the structure of the tender, we fell at the last hurdle, I say we, the sector, because that tender was a £40 million tender with the work divided across the 12 lots for all the work areas that Des and I have described. Those 12 lots then, we needed to describe our capability. There were, I think, 18 questions, and not one question allowed us to give that were lot specific and allowed us to describe our capability, and it effectively was too generic a classification of a procurement event. And we had ecology, for example, which, yes, is niche is the right term for ecology. It's a very small specialist discipline, but it's a very complex discipline. You can imagine the type of crime scenes that an ecologist attends. There was so little space and so few opportunities to describe capability in ecology that effectively we commoditised ecology down to a price alone, and I think that's terrible, and we must move on from that kind of model.
Sorry to keep asking Dr. Pearse, but from your experience as part of an international company, do you think there are models elsewhere that are more conducive to that more strategic approach than your experience in
Yes,
the
I do.
UK?
It's not an issue of public-private. It's about whatever you do, whether you work in the private sector or public sector, you have to deliver to a budget. There is no, science costs, people cost. You've got to pay people. You've got to invest in quality and invest in methods. So whether you create an institute that delivers work in the public sector, that will cost as much. And I would argue more, because one of the private sector strengths is to be lean and be efficient in processing. That will still cost. So the funding has got to be there. And I see models that, the Netherlands Forensic Institute, for example, in the Netherlands, it's one of our most dynamic markets in terms of change, not only through EMSI, but directly through Eurofins and the Maastricht Forensic Institute that we operate from Maastricht. The Netherlands Forensic Institute specifically last year, it's one of the best funded forensic institutes in Europe. They've got a population of 18.3 million. The budget last year was 114 million euros. They overspent by 29 million, so 138 million spend. And that's, that's a matter of fact. We can't.
They're a service provider, not just an oversight body.
No, the Netherlands Forensic Institute is a service provider. Yeah. It's similar to the FSS. The scope of work is a little bit more because they do pathology. And for the last 6 years, we've been working together with them in a delivery model that's for the good of the Dutch criminal justice system, because every forensic institute that I see across Europe through EMSI, through my board position at EMSI, has backlogs, has too much work for the people, etc. So we've worked with them in partnership, in tandem. The journey we've been on hasn't been quite the same, in the sense that the police have very much appreciated some of the services that we provide. We do DNA in 2 days, for example, in the vast majority of cases over there, and we've set up pathology too. So we're just finding our feet in terms of the market there. I'm an advocate of robust state infrastructure working in partnership with the private sector. What all forensic science labs do well is the science. What private sector forensic science labs do well in particular is focus on the right performance measures that deliver forensic science efficiently. That's a balance, because you cannot then create an environment where the pressure to deliver stifles the science and the need to have appropriate forensic strategy. And that's the balance we've got to have.
Can I ask a question about your tender? You mentioned the £40 million tender to a group of police forces.
Yes.
So what form does that take? Are you essentially, it's like a framework agreement, you're pricing for certain tests, or pricing for certain individuals to do those tests? So my question really is, when there is a particular crime, a particular police force that's invoking that contract with you, who decide? Do they decide what tests they want and then say to you, we now have your prices for those tests? And is that how it works?
Yeah, then this is the nub of it's a crucial question and the nub of an issue that really is important, and we need to get right for the good of forensic science. So the general question around the contracts and the procurement. So at the moment, most police forces, all police forces from April next year, except the Metropolitan Police, will be working with Blue Light Commercial. And Blue Light Commercial have bought what's called the next generation procurement in forensics, using a dynamic purchasing system of procurement. And so that's underpinned, as you say, by describing the tests in terms of product codes, and those tests are then commissioned. And that's not a bad thing to have service levels specified, but it's then how you deploy those tests. If you then just have the model where a non-scientific expert or a non-scientist, a police officer, asks for lists of tests, then that's not very good, because that's not a scientific way of approaching the right science to address the investigative need. So let's do what we do well. The police do investigations well, we do science well, and our experts are trained to be able to present science in court to say what the findings mean in the context of the investigation. So the way we express forensic science is that we will talk about, we have two levels, we call it source and activity. So source would be, this is Mark Pearse's DNA, this is some handwriting, this comes from this person. Activity would be, how did that DNA get there? Because it's not about, you could say, without trivialising the DNA process, the simple thing is to get the profile and say it's Mark Pearse's DNA. What's useful to the court and the judge and the criminal justice system is how that DNA got there, and that's what our scientists do. So let's make sure that cases are commissioned in the best possible way, so that the right items are submitted, the right questions are to be addressed, and we use forensic science appropriately.
When the police commission you for a particular crime,
yes,
they don't necessarily ask for all the things you just described about source and how and a wider investigation. They tend to specify tests they want. Is that right?
Exactly. They do. And what's happened in the last more than the last 5 years or 6 years since the last inquiry is that forces have developed submissions units that are in charge of the interface between supplier, between Eurofins or Key or whoever, and the investigating officer. So typically a submissions unit, an officer in the case will ring the submissions unit internally and say, I've got these items, this is the crime, and then the submissions unit will interface with us. And they do a great job. Again, what price justice? There is a price justice. It's the budgets that are given to police forces, so they've got a very difficult job to manage when budgets are in real terms being cut. So we don't argue with the principle of submissions units. In fact, we embrace them. But we must have a contract structure that takes away the scientific discussions and the strategy away from those people, so that we can talk properly around the good of the case. And a model that because you effectively commoditise it if you don't.
Dr. Vanhinsbergh, does the same apply to you? Do you have these contracts with a police force or a group of police forces in the same way that Dr. Pearse has described?
Yes, we do, and we compete for the same contracts. I understand Mark's view, but we came out of the most recent tender rather well. So for us, I think the current structure works well, but it's by no means perfect. I think the biggest challenge we have is getting access to the market, and this goes not just for Key Forensic, but for any SME or startup business or medium-sized business that's trying to break into this market, the barriers are very, very high. Sometimes the barriers are high for a reason. Obviously, on the quality side, we need to be ensuring that we're providing the quality of service that the police and the criminal justice systems need. But sometimes it's just deep down to the structure of the procurement. More recent, the most recent tender was actually more flexible than some have been. And what we've seen in recent years is a rise in what they call managed services. And this is when one large provider looks after the entire contract. And then they have they provide those services either directly to the police forces, or they subcontract them if they can't provide them services themselves. And the problem we have with managed service contracts is we can't bid directly for them, so there's no access to that part of the market. And the only way we could do it would be to provide the full suite of forensic services required, and that's just not practical or commercially viable for us to do. So although we've got some accreditations in many areas, and we do deliver a broad range of services, we are excluded from bidding for managed service contracts. And what we've seen is a domination of those contracts by the bigger providers, obviously Eurofins and Cellmark. And those contracts are pretty much locked down, so there's no access for several years if once those contracts start. And I think it's a real problem. I think for us, we would really encourage greater access for SMEs into the market. It is important that we look at the investment that we could attract into the market. Obviously, Mark's talked about Eurofins investment as a business, but there are many businesses out there that would enter this market if it was more accessible, the barriers to entry weren't quite so high, and also if they could secure a return on their investment. And in order to secure a return on their investment, they obviously need to be generating sufficient revenue. What we've found at Key Forensic in recent years is we've managed to stabilise our business. We've restructured the business a couple of times to be able to achieve that. And we have a very healthy and profitable business. But the issue with investment is you need a level of certainty. And one thing we certainly don't have is certainty. We're still dealing with very short-term contracts. For example, the tender that Mark's just been discussing, that is a 3-year contract. And we celebrate because we've done well in that tender, but we've only got that work secured for 3 years with a possible 2-year extension. Talking to stakeholders about that, that creates a level of uncertainty in terms of our investment plans. And while managed services are in existence, I think that will act as a significant barrier to growth for SMEs such as ourselves. And I think those barriers need to be removed. We need to encourage further investment from the private sector into the market. And I think that will allow the market to breathe and grow and act as a proper competitive market. We are able to compete against Eurofins and Cellmark, but I wouldn't say it was easy. It's a very difficult thing to do. We do have to obviously invest heavily in our R&D ourselves. We've got many different R&D projects going on. We also invest heavily in our accreditation to ensure that we're at least on a par with our competitors. There's constant investment going in. We invest about 10% of our annual revenue on research and development. Our turnover is about 18 million. As I say, we invest in the region of 10% of that. So even though we're an SME, we are trying to support the sector as much as we can. But I say there are too many barriers really for SMEs, and it's getting increasingly difficult. So we're in a good place now, but there's a lot of uncertainties going forward. And one of the biggest pressures, which Mark has mentioned already, is the pressures on police budgets. And what we've seen recently is those pressures have increased now. We're being told by our police customers that they need to cut their budgets by 10 to 15%, and that's based on conversations with some individual forces. And they're in an incredible difficult place, and my concern is not just about the impact on our revenue as a private business, but as Mark has alluded to, it's the impact on the cases themselves, and more importantly, the victims, in those cases. The job of forensic science should be focused around victims, and forensic science can also prevent further victims going forward. There's a lot of work done by forensic scientists, which means we can be more responsive in responding to crimes, and we can prevent perpetrators committing more crimes going forward. For example, particularly in the area of sexual offences, if you apprehend the offender early, it prevents further victims going forward. So I think what I'd like to see really is certainly a review of how policing are dealing with their budgets and how they're dealing with the situation around where they are being really squeezed in terms of their spend. How is the money spent within a police force? How is it allocated across the different areas that they have to look after? I don't envy them the task of doing that, and I know it's incredibly difficult, but we are certainly seeing now an erosion in our margins, which seems to be largely caused by a reduction in submissions coming in from police forces. Now, some of that work may be being done in-house, but I would say that there's no way that all of it's being done in-house. So I think that is inevitably going to have an impact on some case outcomes, because cases aren't being examined in the depth that perhaps they should be, and they were previously.
Okay, thank you. Baroness Neville-Jones has a question.
Chairman, if I'm asking a question you've already covered, you must just say, does the defence ever ask for your services? I mean, I've heard the word police, which is presumably, in the end, likely to be the prosecution. But do you get requests? Is the defence on your radar? I mean, do they have the resources to commission you?
Yes, they do. So we in the acquisition of Orchid Selmat last year, part of their business portfolio is a company called Keith Borer Consultants. So Keith Borer operate in a sort of a sterile corridor from the rest of the business. They are a defence company. They turn over around £2.73 million a year. Difficult to estimate the size of the defence sector from an expert point of view, but I suspect they've got between 20 and 30% of the market share across a range of forensic disciplines, reviewing statements, etc. I have to say this is relatively new to me, and I actually can't quite believe how the process works in commissioning a defence expert. Having been in the sector for 33 years and not done too much defence work, it's been a revelation to me as to how clunky it is and how amateurish it is. I mean, we all know, firstly, a solicitor has to get 3 quotes in specialist areas where there aren't that many people providing the service. Secondly, the legal aid agency negotiates fees down. We're talking about expert witnesses that will affect somebody's liberty. We're negotiating fees down. And thirdly, they don't get paid until the trial is complete. So we could be talking a year or 2 before people get money. And we're talking individual experts in many cases. OK, Keith Borer's got some scale, but the cash flow issues for somebody wanting to come into this sector, I think, are terrible. And thirdly, and the worst part of this, and the most jaw-dropping thing for me, is the rate itself. Right now, we've got the Ministry of Justice who oversee the Crown Prosecution Service on the prosecution side, who pay north of £130 an hour for the kind of services from an expert to do work for them, specifically in court preparation. And then they also oversee the legal aid agency and then pay £83 an hour to an expert providing somebody with defence. That's hardly equality, in my view, and it stinks.
Dr. Vanhinsbergh, would you like to comment?
Yeah, Key Forensic used to do defence work, and the reason we moved away from it is because it wasn't economically viable for the business to do that, and Mark has already mentioned some of the reasons why. For example, prompt payment doesn't exist in that area, so as a forensic science provider working for the defence, you tend not to get paid for a very long time, and you're forever chasing debtors, and that takes up a lot of time and a lot of effort. I think the other areas around legal aid, and clearly there's not been sufficient funding for this area for quite some time, and I think that certainly needs some attention. And I think it wouldn't be attractive to us now, as it currently stands, to re-enter this part of the market, but it would be something we would consider if it became more commercially viable. And I think that's about streamlining the processes that Mark's alluded to, which are very complex. It's about supporting defence solicitors and defence science companies more, not just on a financial level, but looking at the whole process from end to end and streamlining that process. And it's about giving them, access as well to what they need in an efficient manner. So I think there's a number of challenges there in defence. I think that there is a caveat attached to that. I think it's also important that the defence scientists are involved in cases work to the same or very similar qualities and levels of quality that we as forensic science providers do. I think, the bar is very high and it should be very high. And I think at the moment, I'm not sure how that is governed. Really, I think the regulator has probably got a role to play in that to ensure that forensic scientists operate to the same quality.
Can I just ask? You both use the word, I think, defence company. How does this operate then? It's not the chambers of the barristers who How does the system operate? Do they go to a company that specialises in defence evidence, or how does this work?
And then come to you? A solicitor representing somebody will identify the need to do a defence examination in a particular area of specialism, and then they will go to experts or companies who provide services in that particular area.
Lord Berkeley, we've covered procurement quite extensively. Have you any further questions about procurement? Lord Berkeley's coming in online.
A question on procurement, because one thing I've picked up from both witnesses is the importance of having long-term contracts, so that they can continue their work in and out of different clients. My worry is, having heard Dr. Pearse's response to you, Chair, about the type of contract, do I get the impression that the police, who are letting many of the contracts in this country, they give us a kind of framework contract, and then the contractors, be it one of you two witnesses or other people, basically say, yes, well, we can do that, but we'll tell you how to do it and how much it's going to cost. And that's the way it goes. Now, is there any sort of competitive element between the different contractors bidding as to how they would deliver? I find this a little bit confusing at the moment. Or is it really just a cost-plus basis?
The contracts are award, so you bid for regional contracts. Several forces typically will be part of that consortium. You've already qualified, you've demonstrated your competency to bid for this competition or tender, and then after the tender's finished, then you're awarded an amount of work for the police forces in that consortium. You don't then have to bid on each case. You're as Des said, for the last tender, you're awarded the work for 3 years. And then the amount of work you've got and the forces that you're going to work with is prescribed at the beginning of that, and you carry on transacting.
I see.
The amount that you charge and how you charge is determined by the specifications and the products, as we described at the beginning of this, that are set in stone up front.
The police in question actually decide how much of your services they want.
Yeah. Through the Blue Light Commercial at the moment are leading police procurement, but yes, they do.
Yep.
Yes.
Ernest Walmsley.
Thank you. Just a little clarification.
Yeah, it's worth also saying that the volumes within contracts aren't guaranteed. So there are no guaranteed volumes of work coming to forensic science providers within those contracts.
Dr. Pearse, you mentioned somebody called Blue Light earlier on.
Yes.
I just want a little clarification of who they are and what they do. Are they a sort of middleman? Or do they manage the contracts as they go along?
Okay,
what do they do exactly?
They're an organisation that's been in place for, as I understand it, two or 3 years now, maybe 3 or 4. So they're a non-for-profit organisation wholly owned by Police and Crime, Association of Police and Crime Commissioners and the National Police Chiefs Council, and they're responsible for procuring things for the police service. So forensic science is a category of services for the police that will be quite a small part, I would guess, of the overall things that are bought for the police, which could be helicopter and air services, I guess it could be stationery, uniforms, etc. And so there'll be a lead category manager for forensic science, and then a number of people within the forensic science category that will ensure contracts are adhered to, etc. But we're just finding our feet as to how we work with blue light commercial, and and how we manage contracts. And for me, this is where the model comes in, and where Lord Berkeley's right that longer term contracts will be correct, and I understand where Des is coming from, that it's not great to have a lockout. So we've got to, on an SME, so we've got to come to some agreement where we can have a long-term relationship, where we have some certainty of volume, because again, Des has rightly said that the volumes aren't guaranteed, where we can put together a set of commercials that are robustly managed by blue light commercial. Our profitability maybe can be challenged and audited to make sure that we're providing fit-for-purpose services with the right pricing for a public service, but we can then focus on getting the best out of forensic science and working with investigators, working with academia on R&D, and introducing this concept, I think, of strategic governance, where we sit down with the NPCC, we sit down with the Home Office, maybe with the Crown Prosecution Service, and we say, right, what are your policing priorities? What are your unmet policing needs from an R&D perspective, and what are our quality risks in the round, and what are we going to do to work together for the best of forensic science in the criminal justice system? How are we going to manage that on a contract by contract basis with blue light commercial, and then what does that mean for case management, where our expert scientists can go to a scene and work with SIOs to develop an appropriate case strategy? And that threesome of strategic, contract, case governance is what Scotland do very well, because they're enabled by the infrastructure. But we can do that in the private sector as well, because we do labs very well and very efficiently. We just need unleashing in a proper governance framework, that we get a proper collaboration that works for the long term.
As you probably both gathered, we have lots of questions on the commercial aspects that we're talking about. Lord Berkeley, you want to come back in, I think?
Thank you, Chair. Could I just come back very quickly? I just asked Dr. Pearse, we had a very interesting answer from Dr. Vanhinsbergh about how the industry dealt with the defence sector. Could you comment on what do you think the defence sector, are they dealt with fairly and comprehensively, or is there something that needs to be done there?
Well, I think I described to you the process as I see it, as somebody relatively new to the governance of a business in the defence sector. I described to you the process of having to commission 3 bids, having to haggle with the legal aid agency, and then not getting paid for several months, and then having that contrast between the rate for a prosecution witness, from the Crown Prosecution Service on court preparation is typically £130 an hour, and the typical rate for a defence expert is £83 an hour. As I said before, that is not equality of arms by any means, in any way, shape or form, and that is not where we want to be in my view, in terms of what we do and how we support defence examinations.
Yeah. Dr. Vanhinsbergh, anything to add to that? Perhaps not.
No, I've got nothing further to add. I mean, that funding situation really needs to be sorted out, I think.
Baroness Neville-Jones and then Baroness Young.
Within your contract, you described how you get a contractual basis. When the police come to you on a given case, am I right in thinking that they say to you, we want you to do the following tests? Or do they say, which I haven't heard you say, is we want to discover the following? So what I'm getting at is, do they tell you what their problem is, and you then apply the necessary resources to try and solve whatever the issue is that they're trying to get to the bottom of? Or do they have a preconceived notion of the information that they need for their case, and they tell you what tests they want in order to verify that particular thesis? Yeah. Which way round is it?
Well, and again, the answer is a bit disappointing from your perspective, maybe, because it's a mix of the two. I think if we wound the clock back 10 or 13 years to just after the closure of the FSS, it will be very much more towards the police telling us that they want test 1, 2 and 3 please and stop, and in fact they would restrict and limit the items that would be submitted to ensure that we took a staged approach to help manage budgets.
And they can save their budget.
Yes, but let me be clear. That was probably the situation 10 or 15 years ago. The situation's moved on. The professionalism showed by submissions units working against tight budgets across the country in police forces. I admire the guys in those teams, and we try and establish an effective relationship where we can develop strategy. But it's always the tension point. Because the scientist wants everything that will possibly contribute to the investigative question that's been asked, but there is a price to budget. There is a price to forensic science, and it's the budget. So it's that balance. The crucial thing is that we don't compromise the interpretation of the evidence, and the expert can discharge their responsibility as an expert witness to confidently say they've seen all the things that could be relevant to this case and their interpretation of the findings. And we work hard with all our forces to make sure that that's in place and is as efficient as it possibly can be.
Dr. Vanhinsbergh, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, we're the same. We operate in a similar way. We encourage our scientists and train our scientists to ensure there's a conversation before any examination starts. There's proper case assessment done, and that case assessment is peer reviewed as well. So we're really focused on achieving the best evidence. And also, we do consider value for money in our approach as well. We are sympathetic to the pressures that the police forces are under, and we try to get them best value out of the information that we can glean from the exhibits that I've submitted. I think that there is a large variation between police forces. I would say that I don't think there's a standardised submission policy across policing, and I think that is one problem that perhaps needs to be addressed. I know that the Forensic Capability Network, who work on behalf of the MPCC, are looking at this, and they've got a project running to try and look at submissions policy. But I think that's certainly something that could be more standardised because, as Mark says, we're all working to the same scientific principles. We're trying to achieve best evidence whilst being sympathetic to the pressure, the enormous pressure that police budgets are currently under. So I think that there does need to be a rather urgent piece of work on, submissions policy to ensure that a high quality and standardised approach is used across all police forces.
Baroness Young, do you want to come in? No, okay. Baroness Northover?
Well, I think we've covered quite a few things, but can I just ask whether you feel you're now competing with police forces, taking forensic science in-house to cut costs?
Well, yes, we are to a degree. I think, and again, this is where we need a consistent and robust strategy at government level. So the government decided that the Forensic Science Service wasn't the delivery vehicle back in 2012 at the final stages of the closure of the FSS, and decided to use the private sector. Given that strategic decision, we then need consistency, or else we get a very destabilising and uncertain business model to work with. Des has already pointed out that the volumes in the contracts, volumes of work that we get given in the contracts are estimates and not guaranteed. So when we're building our capacity and investing in infrastructure, it's very hard. And so if you then get the police for whatever reason, and it could be all sorts of reasons, but typically it's a cost-saving issue, deciding to do it themselves, then that's a destabilising position. And I would say, there's been several attempts, and there's been one very recent one, which I'm not going into the detail, but several attempts to set up scientific process. And that's what we do well. We're scientists, we're science managers, and we deliver robust, quality forensic science. The police are investigators, but can recruit scientists, but then don't have the infrastructure and the general organisational culture to support the implementation and achieve the necessary quality hurdles and barriers that are rightly in place to make sure that the science meets the needs of the criminal justice system. So it's a mess. It really is a mess, and a mixed message and a mixed strategy when forces start to insource. But when they do, yes, they are in competition with us.
And Dr. Vanhinsbergh, would you agree?
Yes, I would. And I'd like to expand on that a little bit. I mean, I think the true cost of insourcing, that is police setting up their own laboratories, is poorly understood, and to my knowledge isn't really published. You know, and I think, again, I think we would benefit from a piece of work on that to really understand what it costs to set up and accredit a forensic science laboratory. So I think doing something in-house can sometimes be perceived as being cheaper because you're not sending it to a private provider. But that I don't believe that can be the case. And the reason I say that is because, you know, we have a handful of laboratories. Eurofins has a handful of laboratories covering, you know, the whole area of England and Wales and beyond. And we handle tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of tests every year. And there's economies of scale within that. You know, we need the sufficient volume to achieve our margins. But we can achieve those margins also by ensuring we implement the efficiencies by doing large-scale analysis and investing in, you know, automated processes and data handling processes. For me, it cannot be cheaper for individual forces to carry out these tests themselves, you know, because they don't have the same economy of scale. But I do appreciate that some forensic science perhaps doesn't need to reside with the force for operational reasons. But, you know, I think it would be interesting to see and establish what the true cost of insourcing is.
Lord Ranger.
Yes, thank you both for your answers on that point. I just wanted to pick up, you mentioned economies of scale. Surely also the level of skills and services that you provide would be hard to replicate in-sourced by each force. But also conflict of interest. How does that get managed? Dr. Vanhinsbergh, if I could go to you first.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, where we find ourselves often is that when a police laboratory is established, and we've had some experience of this relatively recently, then there's obviously a recruitment drive by the police force that's establishing that capability. And it will often be a case of staff moving from a private company, such as ourselves, to the police laboratory. And the reason they move is because the police laboratories typically pay quite a bit more in salary. And obviously there is a pension on top of that to these scientists. So they make it very attractive for scientists to move over to the police laboratories. It's very, very difficult for us to compete against that in the current climate because our margins are very thin. So, you know, we can't just pay everybody more. It just doesn't work economically. Can you remind me a second part of your question, please?
Thank you for highlighting the cannibalisation of your organisation through this insourcing. But the conflict where the force themselves is doing the work, is there not a conflict of interest there? Should that not be the whole reason it's sent to an outside body for independence?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, from my point of view, Des, I think...
Yeah, I think all forensics... Sorry.
No, go on, Des.
I was just going to say, Mark, that we carry out a proper case assessment and interpretation. Integrity is the number one for us in terms of the values that we work to. It's very important we maintain a level of independence. I think, I'm not saying it's impossible within a police force. It is possible to implement those processes, but I think it would be very, very challenging in that sort of environment where there is a real focus on prosecution work. You know, our scientists are highly trained in being impartial in their approach. And that's why case assessment, proper case assessment and interpretation done up front and done through the entire life of the case is so essential. And the principles behind that need to be maintained, which is, you know, you look at things considering both versions of events, if you like, and the version of events of the prosecution and the defence, and you assess the strength of evidence based on competing propositions. And I think, you know, that's a well-established technique. It's been used for years. It's a very effective technique. And my concern, which echoes some of Mark's comments, is that, as we call it, a CAI, a case assessment and interpretation approach, is not necessarily adopted to the same level within police laboratories. Having said that, some police forces operate very high quality forensic science units, and they do have the same level of accreditation, and they're also compliant to the forensic science regulator code as well, or regulator code as it's now known. And so they do, in theory, operate to the same standards as us.
Dr. Pearse, anything to add?
Little to add to that. Des has covered it. I think it's all about public confidence in forensic science. I think to have a sterile corridor between the organisation doing the investigation and independent science is a good thing. Having said that, I work for the Metropolitan Police and gave evidence as a Metropolitan Police employee. So you're constantly juggling what Des said, really, which is integrity, the deployment of the scientific method as an independent thinking scientist versus cognitive bias from working in an organisation that is prosecuting a case. And there's no right answer to that. I think the overarching thing should be A, cognitive bias, and B, public confidence.
Thank you. Viscount Stansgate.
I want to turn to your ability to provide a range of services. And one of the concerns that's been brought to our attention is that for the financial problems and the funding squeeze to which reference has already been made, it will lead to the extinction of specific specialisms, such as, and I'll give some examples, fibre analysis, blood pattern analysis, toxicology, as both police forces and the companies focus on fewer services and types of test based on what is sustainable to provide. Now, have you seen this contraction take place? Do you feel that it is leading to the possible loss of specialisms of the kind I've just mentioned? And if so, are there any ways of preserving the specialist disciplines within your companies?
Yes. I mean, we perhaps go back to the list that you provided just for clarity, because there's a danger we create some wrong sentiment here. So toxicology, for me, is not an area of work that falls into this category. Experienced casework toxicologists that look at complex compounds involved in suspicious deaths. There's a paucity of them in the country, but we're not talking about those services at the moment being uneconomic and not viable. Pretty much the same with blood pattern analysis, to be fair. So I would strike off toxicology and blood pattern analysis on your list, but certainly include fibres and anything else within the marks and traces group. So physical marks such as tool marks, footwear marks, albeit that's been done in police forces, and traces of evidence such as glass, paint, fibres, gunshot residues would all fit into this. And for the vast majority of those, history has shown that they've tended to be used in acquisitive crime in quite some volume, and so the amount of cases per year to support the investigation of acquisitive crime historically has been quite high in the marks and traces category. Obviously the evidence types get used in serious crime in a mission critical way, as has been described previously with other people's evidence. What we've seen over probably the last 10 years is the increasing reliance on DNA, fingerprints and CCTV for the investigation of acquisitive crime, and the collapse of the demand for marks and traces service, which are often perceived to be inconclusive or corroborative in nature. So I won't use the word inconclusive, but corroborative in nature, supporting a proposition rather than necessarily providing the name of a person, which will be useful in investing in an acquisitive crime investigation. So where we end up is a volume of marks and traces work that is, we were talking previously, 3 or 4% of our business, where the volumes are suboptimal. The cost of delivery, the maintenance of accreditation, the investment in the infrastructure isn't justified by the revenue that's brought in. Yet the police customer will tell us quite rightly and understandably that those services are still crucial to provide support to investigations of serious crime and threats to national security, as was discussed earlier. So we're in this strange limbo land. Our response has been, from our perspective, I'll let Des comment on what Key Forensics have done. We've done a couple of things. One is to address the shortfall in revenue through the levers that we can pull. There's two really. One is pricing, and so we've worked with police forces to raise the pricing in these areas quite significantly. But the downside of that is that unless you then have a paradigm shift in the culture of investigations and the use of these evidence types, that raising price just means that the volume falls further and you get into a worsening situation. So that's one lever that we've pulled, and so we're in the middle there. And then secondly, we've, through the acquisition of Orchid Cellmart, with Eurofins Forensic Services working together with Orchid Cellmark as sister companies, we've been able to consolidate and take advantage of a consolidated, more efficient model. So and with the new lab I talked about in our lab in the Midlands, we've got to a position where we now have a workable model that will not lose any of these evidence types and will safeguard each of the ologies, each of the fibres, your glass, etc. But we still are loss-making and so we need to fine-tune the model, not so that we increase pricing so that we have demand going down further, but where we sit down and say, right, there's not enough work here to justify multiple providers, there's not enough work here to really have a normal business relationship where it's supply and demand, as we have with road traffic toxicology, as we would have with a DNA sample. We need to sit down and say, what do we value? And I've put forward and proposed, actually with Cellmark in 2021, different models for the government and for policing to consider. And we need to take these models seriously now, because we're on the brink of losing some of these evidence types, because we need to take action quickly. And models such as having a national retainer fee for critical services like this that are suboptimal in terms of volume would safeguard those, would guarantee revenue and allow us to make the investment and safeguard those disciplines for the future. And at the same time, we work together at a strategic level with policing and with Blue Light Commercial to start doing continuous professional development with crime scene investigators and investigating officers to make sure they are aware of the full and are reminded of the full potential evidential value of these disciplines. And that will in itself kickstart discussions on the use of those methods again and make sure that the demand is pump primed, if you like, not suggesting that we use them in areas where the value for money on the case and the case type suggests that the case isn't commissioned, but where we give this evidence chance to flourish. And I think we need another model, because it's not going to continue at the level it is now. We haven't lost any service types, but we've certainly downsized, we've certainly consolidated, and we've certainly got to the point where the service lines, in particular in marks and traces, are not profit-making and therefore not sustainable.
And would it be right to say that as a result of this, you fear for the future because there may be miscarriages of justice that cannot properly be rectified because of the loss of the services to which you've referred?
Ultimately, yes. I mean, I'd need to walk through and step through with you exactly how the miscarriage of justice would arise. But if the miscarriage of justice arises because a defendant doesn't have access to forensic science that would have exonerated them, then yes. Equally, in terms of investigations that could be threats to national security, could be and often are serious crime investigations. These evidence types such as fibres, fibroblastic fusion in hit and runs and terrorism incidents have been critical evidence that have complemented the DNA evidence and have been part of a six-figure investigation that have led to the prosecution of some of the most notorious criminals. And so we accept, I think, that those services are really important to maintain. We need to stop talking about that and actually do something to put together an economic model to make them sustainable. And what's such a crying shame is that the level of funding we're talking about is in the weeds. I mean, we are, overall at the moment, our service in that line is, let's say, 3 to 4 million. We don't need much more than that to have. To unleash it, let it loose and flourish and work and develop the science and maybe work with academia and identify better methods and better instruments and keep our infrastructure and instrumentation up to speed in these areas that often, particularly on the traces side, use a lot of spectroscopy and need refreshing of methods and analytical equipment.
Thank you very much. Dr. Vanhinsbergh, is there something you could say on this general subject?
Yeah, I would say that we've tried to retain our marks and traces services for many years, and up until recently, I think we've succeeded in doing that. The incentive really for that was certainly not a commercial one. These disciplines don't generate any profit margin for us. In fact, they're loss making. one of the main incentives for retaining these services was that they were often bundled in with another service, such as biology casework, and you couldn't actually bid for the work unless you had marks and traces for many forces, unless you had marks and traces and biology services. I'm pleased to say that that work has now been unbundled, which kind of de-risks that situation for us, because obviously, as I've said, biology services are one of our biggest revenue streams, and we wouldn't want things to return to that area, recognising that if we don't carry out marks and traces ourselves, we do have to have the competency to recover the trace evidence so it can be sent on to another provider. I mean, this year we've seen a significant change in marks and traces because the recent tender that we've been discussing, we were unable to bid because all the marks and traces services were included in that lot. And because we couldn't deliver on every lot and we would be dependent on a subcontract effectively with Eurofin, then, we were unable to bid, which means we no longer have a contract to deliver marks and traces services. And where we might look to retain some of those services to a degree, for example, where we might apply them to cold cases or defence work, it looks less and less economically viable now to retain. And the likelihood is that we will lose some experts in these fields, particularly in the area of gunshot residue and glass analysis and footwear analysis. So, we are, I think, in a worse state than we were. And the frustration from my perspective is that we've not been aided by the procurement process, as I said, because of the tender structuring. But also, Mark and I and others have been highlighting this issue for several years. This is not a new issue. This has been flagged up for several years, and very little has been done about it. And the attention at the moment seems to be all on digital forensics. But as Mark says, these evidence types can be absolutely crucial in solving cases, and some of the highest profile cases that we know. And I think it would be a tragedy to lose them from the sector. What are we doing about it in terms of other areas of what we might call niche services? We've just partnered with an academic partner, and we've established a new forensic ecology service. And we were successful in the recent tender, so that business will start trading. They won't mind me saying, but it's run by the University of Exeter. And I think maybe some of the answers to these questions do lie in academia and these sort of partnerships with academics. And we'll see how that business model goes. But I have to say, when you look at the commercial side of that, it will be a challenge. It will be a challenge for the university to ensure that is commercially viable. So we are trying to support these services as much as I can, but as Mark says, I think we're probably down to the in the final stages really, and I think it's the last chance saloon for many of these services.
We have got a few more questions. We're coming to a close, so I hope my colleagues can be brief, and I hope you can be reasonably brief in your answers. But it's a measure of how much interest we have in hearing from you that we're having all these questions. So, Baroness Northover.
Yes. This, in some ways, follows on. And the question is, are forensic science companies able to invest significantly in R&D? Are you able to keep up with the cutting edge? And then leading on from that, is there an opportunity to use AI for data analysis? Both of you have already said that you don't focus on digital forensics, but can AI be used in terms of what you're doing at the moment and what you're doing in terms of R&D?
Right. Well, from our point of view for R&D, we've got, I guess, in the spectrum of R&D, literally, you've got research at one end, blue sky research and development at the other. We probably, the coming together of Selmark and Eurofins Forensic Services last year, we total well over 50 research projects that we have ongoing, some of which are method developments for the sake of better service levels, and some are more blue sky projects. And we do blue sky projects, and we do projects. We support King's College in particular, but other universities as well, with PhD students and MSc students. And we've done product development work in various areas where we see a potentially unmet need in the police. The issue in this area, though, is we will invest, yes, to improve process for the good of service levels and sustainability within the business. But if we're going to invest for new service offerings, we need to be able to get a return on investment, and we need to understand where that's going to take us for the upfront investment, because it's quite expensive and quite a lengthy process. And I'll perhaps give you just an example of one thing that we did, which I did allude to right at the beginning, but we developed a method within Eurofins that is particularly effective at raising DNA profiles from fired ammunition cartridges. And we did that development work with two particular potential customers. And so we worked very closely. They had a firearms issue, two very different customers, so different types of criminal activity, but two firearms issues where they said that if we were to improve success rates, we would see a significant upturn in usage of that method and their willingness to spend budget and buy that technique. And so we did a bit of demand forecasting with them, which set the business case in stone and justified the investment. And the demand forecasting suggested that those two customers would spend £1 million a year or thereabouts on this new method. So we set about developing this method. The typical success rate of raising any kind of DNA profile from a firearms cartridge is about 4% prior to this, and we raised that to 54%. This method, just 2 weeks ago, at the International Symposium of Human Identification in Florida, was independently analysed and evaluated by the University of Uppsala in Sweden and compared with 9 other methods globally, and the technique comes out way on top. So we've got a really top draw method. That £1 million forecast in revenue by that customer resulted in 2024 of a spend of £10,000. Where's that return on investment? And that little example, and I'm not singing the praises of the technique, although it's great, the point I want to make is that how we identify unmet needs, how we innovate working with academia, and how that leads to a return on investment needs some work. Let's put it that way.
Dr. Vanhinsbergh, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I agree with that as well. And I think the focus tends to be on grant funding, and it's been historically very difficult for a forensic science project to be supported by grant funding, particularly when you're competing against genetics and this type of work that's done, for example, at the Sanger Centre, groundbreaking research that's leading to medical diagnosis. And I think, we're in the same arena when it comes to grant funding, really, and it's very difficult to come up with a project which can compete. But I think there is an awful a lot of funding in the private sector, an awful lot of funding. And I think, we need to release that. And the way we release that is we open up the market a bit more. I think the market is too closed, as I said earlier. But also, as Marcus just said, we need to demonstrate that there's going to be a return on investment. There are investors out there who will put enormous amounts of money into forensic science. And not for hockey stick growth or anything like that. They're looking for reasonable returns on their investment. And I think we need to establish a climate where we can really attract private investors. And I don't think the current climate is in a fit state to do that.
Thank you. Baroness Neville-Jones.
I think just to add to that, I would just say that at the moment, Key Forensics does carry out R&D, but at a small scale. Any sort of blue sky research, we would lean on our academic partners and support them in that. We're involved in knowledge transfer partnerships and other areas to support our business and to support our academic partners. So we're doing our bit, but as an SME, we can only afford to invest, as I say, about 10% at the moment of our annual revenue in R&D, and that tends to be focused very heavily on police records. So we listen to our customers, we sit down with our customers on a regular basis, we gauge their needs, and we introduced improvements in efficiency and reliability, so we deliver them better services and ultimately better services to the criminal justice system. And that's where the focus is.
Thank you. Baroness Neville-Jones.
Thank you, Chairman. Let me turn for a moment to regulation and accreditation. One of the changes that's taken place since the report that this committee wrote in 2019 is that the forensic science regulator has been given statutory powers, which in principle one should welcome. But I think the question I want to ask you really is, how do you assess the changes that have taken place? There are now codes of practice for forensic science providers, and yet at the same time we hear that they're regarded as being very onerous not necessarily very appropriate, expensive, and potentially capable of putting, because of cost, small providers out of business. So my question really is, how do you assess the current regulation and accreditation? So, and do you think that they've actually resulted in higher quality work? Have they been responsible, have contributed to the quality of their work, as well as presumably one of their functions, maintaining competition? Is the system proportionate? So, and if it isn't, do you have thoughts on what changes are needed? Subsidiary of that is there's obviously companies like yours, and then when it comes to expert witnesses, acting individually, should they be subject to this regime as well, in your view? So number of questions there about how well you assess the system's working in relation to its declared objectives.
Dr. Pearse, would like to start?
Okay, yeah. I personally, from a Eurofins perspective, I think it's working as well as it can be. I think it was a very good initiative. I think what we were facing were expert witnesses going into trials and presenting themselves in front of the court with very little way of demonstrating compliance to a quality culture and a standard. This is good. It's done well in defining what forensic science activity is all about, what the standards that are expected. That's detailed in a very lengthy and detailed code of practice. And I think generally, as the private sector, certainly Des can comment, but speaking as Eurofins, we've embraced that really, and the private sector has implemented the code very quickly and effectively. I think there was a suggestion earlier in a discussion that the nature of the market meant that perhaps the regulator had a light touch on the private sector. That's far from the case. We're fully subject to regulation, and we have a culture of self-referral, and I think that's a very positive step, so that we can refer up to the regulator where there's a potential miscarriage of justice or something happened on a case that needs alerting to the criminal justice system, and most importantly we need to learn what the corrective actions are and what process improvements needs to be made. I think that works very well. Clearly there's issues around how ISO accreditation sits side by side with the code of practice accreditation, and probably we've got a new regulator now, and maybe the excellent work done by the previous regulator will be picked up by the new person who will take forward working with UCAS and accreditation, and what actual specific mechanisms do you use to demonstrate compliance with the code? Is it ISO accreditation? Is it not? But as a tool of risk management and as a reassurance around a robust quality culture, I think it's very good. And not only do I think it's very good, but I know because I work very closely with the NRGD, which is the Dutch Register of Forensic Experts. I've hosted them over here together with the regulator, and they look at our system with some envy, because their system is based on an expert-led approach, as you allude to, and I don't think that's the right way forward. I think from a business perspective, running a business, that would be incredibly difficult to manage, keeping personal records and looking at everybody's specific position. I think the system works quite well as it is, to be fair.
Dr. Vanhinsbergh, what would you like to add?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the code for us provides us with a really good framework. I think something that was absent in the past. Of course, it sets the bar quite high, as it should. And we strive to ensure we maintain compliance for all the forensic science activities we carry out. There's also a code of conduct incorporated in that, which we find extremely useful for our scientists. Details how they're expected to operate in the criminal justice sector. So I think I would echo a lot of Mark's comments there. I think accreditation as well is worth mentioning that. I think it does have an enormous value. Often we do get frustrated, when we're having to entertain UCAS, the accrediting body, for many weeks every year. But I think in the round, it does lead to a better maintenance of quality and sometimes an improvement in quality as well within our organisation. So I think one comment I would make on that, though, is that I think sometimes the process does seem quite convoluted and inefficient. This is the process of assessment by UCAS. And when we look to some organisations outside the UK, and I point to Ireland really, and what we hear about their assessments, they do seem to be a lot more straightforward and no less robust than the assessments we have in the UK. So I think something could be done there to ensure that, certainly for smaller providers, I'm not necessarily talking about Key because we're a medium-sized company, but for the very small providers, I can see why they would be quite onerous. And the other comment I would make on UCAS really is around the technical assessors that they employ. They employ a number of technical assessors that are experts in their field, that obviously provide independent assessment of how we adhere to our codes and our code of practice, and also the FSR code and the ISO standards that we operate to. And I think there has been a shortage over recent years of experts in working for UCAS in certain areas, particularly in toxicology, for example. And I think that there's a number of problems with that. It causes delays in the system. So if we're trying to develop new methods and we're trying to improve our methods and achieve extensions to our scope of accreditation, a shortage of technical assessors can delay that process. And that's very important for us because sometimes, we are sticking to a very tight investment timetable, and any delay is costly in terms of time, but also in ensuring that those, it prevents those new services and those improved services being delivered out to our customers. So I think, sometimes that can cause delays. And the other problem with having such a limited number of technical assessors is that sometimes you can deal with situations where the opinion of one or very few people becomes the rule, and then that's applied across the sector, and that has been problematic in some areas. So we'd like to see that UCAS expanding their breadth and the raft of technical assessors that are available to them.
Thank you.
When I think about costs and I think about what keeps me awake at night, it's not the cost of accreditation, to be honest with you. It is substantial. For example, we're likely to spend up to £200,000 in 2026 on accreditation. That's not what keeps me awake in terms of costs. There are much bigger costs out there for forensic science providers, some of which we've alluded to already, including the cost of retaining a highly skilled workforce.
What would you give them out of 10?
Thank you.
What would you give them out of 10?
UCAS or the regulator? The office?
You can divide it.
UCAS or the regulator?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just both.
What would you give them out of 10? Go on then.
Risky.
Yeah, it's risky for me to go first, I think.
Maybe you can reflect on that. I'm afraid we need to come to a close. We have one final question from Baroness Walmsley.
Okay.
Thank you very much. Well, there have clearly been some long-standing issues, and it's our job to make some recommendations to government to help to address them. And we usually try and suggest things that are very urgent and need addressing straight away, and sometimes some longer term, maybe infrastructure or other things that need addressing in the long term. So I'm hoping that you will both be able to give us some suggestions for both kinds of recommendations, and I'll perhaps come to you first, Dr. Vanhinsbergh. And first of all, can I just say to you, thank you for being the first witness who mentioned victims of crime unprompted today. Personally, I think that's a very important aspect of the work we're doing. So can you give us an urgent action for government and something more long-term?
Yep, sure. I think for us, we would like to see an alleviation of the pressure on policing and the police budgets, particularly that part of the budget that's being diverted to, try and cover science testing. That's the sort of work we carry out rather than digital. So I would really like to see there's some action there, that policing receives the proper funding that enables them to freely submit exhibits that clearly need to be examined into the private sector labs. And my concern, as I said before, is not just one about revenue It's really about focusing on what we're here for and ensuring that criminal justice is delivered. So that's my kind of the short-term plea really is that proper and also connected to that, without wishing to go on too long, connected to that, I'd like some proper examination on how police budgets are allocated as well. Talking longer term, I mean, as I've mentioned earlier, I think, and I may appear a bit selfish here, but I feel I am representing not just Key Forensic, but also other SMEs across the sector. I think one thing I really would stress is that we need to have greater access to the market, particularly now we're dealing with an even larger monopoly than was in existence previously, you know, and it's important the market is opened up, and I think that will bring added benefits. It will allow us to deliver additional services directly to forces. It will attract new business, it will attract new investment, and that will also support innovation, research and development.
Dr. Pearse?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, two very quick ones for me, because I think we've got two burning platforms, so it would be wrong not to mention both, and we've mentioned them, touched on them already. One is marks and traces. So we really need a new funding model that needs to be put in place based on a retainer fee, reflecting the new market position and safeguarding the services in marks and traces, such as fibres, as we've talked about. And then the legal aid fee needs addressing, and the whole commissioning process, it needs immediate attention. It's ridiculous, really. It's not equality when the MOJ presides over a prosecution and legal aid agency where the prosecution gets at least 50% more fees. I think that's wrong. And then more longer term, I think the whole model of how we procure forensic science, I understand where Des is coming from. The market isn't very big. We need to accept that. We need to accept the position, accept the need for the involvement of SMEs and the variety of services that they would bring to the table, but where we work strategically with policing to do things like forecasting demand and aligning capacity and for the good of the case.
Thank you very much indeed, both of you. That's a very good point at which to conclude. You've been extremely patient answering our many questions. It's been very informative for us. We're very grateful. So that concludes today's public